Hello, church family. Welcome to today's Sunday school lesson. We are in session 7 entitled God's Commands. And our key idea this week is God reveals his character and standards for holy living. And we're in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. We're going to start by asking the question, what bizarre warnings or instructions have you read or heard about? And what did you think about that warning? The warning that our text mentions is instructions on a lawnmower: don't use for trimming your hedge. Why would you use a lawnmower for trimming a hedge? Why would a lawnmower have that warning on it? Well, because they have gotten a report or maybe even sued by someone trying to use that lawnmower to trim a hedge and then ended up injuring themselves. And so to protect themselves from further legal issues, the company puts a warning: don't use to trim your hedges. Or on an iron, do not iron clothing items while wearing them, because someone tried to iron the clothes while wearing them. Companies include these types of warnings so that they don't get sued by people who are trying to make a quick buck or maybe aren't the smartest. But anyway, what happens to get these kinds of warnings? So we're going to be looking today at the Ten Commandments, and these are not warnings as much as they are God's commands for Israel to keep them holy, to separate them from the nations around them. So we're going to be looking at two different theological elements. First off is a theophany. A theophany is a physical appearance or personal manifestation of God. And in the Old Testament, this occurs as visions or as an angel, or the burning bush for Moses. And then he also met Moses face to face on Mount Sinai. Now, Moses didn't get to see God's face. He got to see him as he passed, and still Moses glowed from the glory of the Lord. And so we're going to be reading about what happens, what God gave Moses on Mount Sinai. And so we're starting there in chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. This is Moses speaking God speaking through Moses the Ten Commandments. Then God spoke all these words: I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. Do not have other gods beside me. Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow and worship to them, and do not serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. Do not misuse the name of the Lord your God, because the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You must not do any work, you, your son or daughter, or male or female servant, your livestock, or the resident alien who is within your city gates. For the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything in them in 6 days. Then he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not give false testimony against your neighbor. Do not covet your neighbor's house. Do not covet your neighbor's wife, his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Sorry, I'm pulling up Exodus chapter 19 very quickly. 19. There we go. Just wanted to have this for reference, for context in a second. Anyway, so we have first, in our first section, God's identity. God tells the Israelites who he is yet again. So he's said this many times over the last 20 chapters. He said, I am the Lord your God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am the one who brought you out of Egypt. I am the one who rescued you from slavery in Egypt, from Pharaoh and from Pharaoh's army. I'm the one who led you across the Red Sea and parted it and destroyed your enemies. He's constantly reminding them of who he is. So there, verses 1 and 2, he says, then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. He's identifying himself. He's reminding the Israelites who he is and why he has the authority that he does. So these 10 Commandments, they kind of represent a constitution or a governing document for Israel at this point. The text notes that God spoke these words directly to the people. Rather, I said Moses a second ago, but actually, this is God speaking to all the people directly, not through Moses. I was mistaken a second ago. But then he says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery, identifying himself, making his authority known, making his character known once again to them. So why do you think God introduced the commandments by reminding the people of who he is and what he has done? Well, if you just hear a random voice and it doesn't identify itself, you ought not trust it. If you just hear a voice telling you, hey, you should do this thing, you should probably identify who the voice belongs to first. You shouldn't just trust voices. To quote Monty Python, a very non-biblical, very extra-biblical text or writer and filmmaker, Women in Lakes, it's to paraphrase him, not quote him. Women in lakes should not be the ones determining kings, referring to King Arthur becoming king because of the sword that he pulled from the Lady of the Lake's hand, Excalibur. So God has that authority. God has the authority to do all these things and to then command what he's going to command, verses 3 through 17. So what aspects of God's character do we usually emphasize? Do we emphasize his love? Do we emphasize his grace and mercy? Do we emphasize his justice, his just nature? Or do we emphasize his wrath and his rage that is shown through the Old Testament against nations who would not or do not believe in him? Well, I think that there is a movement nowadays to downplay and to try to minimize the justice of God, and we try. There was actually an ancient mystic religion called Gnosticism that actually purported that the God of the Old Testament that we know as Yahweh is actually an evil being because of all the things that he did to those who did not honor his name, and that he was an evil being. And it's obviously false, it's obviously heretical, but that is an idea that many people have had, and even into the modern times, in the 21st century, there are people who want to downplay or even negate the God of the Old Testament, say this is a different God than we worship in the New Testament, whose son is Jesus. And that couldn't be more false. That could not be more misleading or intentionally dishonest to people. God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament, whose son is Jesus, who was eternal, uncreated, who is there with the Father at creation. By all things were created through him and for him, and the Holy Spirit there eternally with them as well. The power of God binding all things, breathing life into all things, and also there at creation. None of these persons of the Trinity have ever been separate, have ever been apart from one another, or at odds with one another. And so we have to, when we read about God's character, we have to take all of God's character. God is perfectly just. God is perfectly merciful. God is perfectly loving. God is perfectly kind. All of the fruit of the Spirit you can attribute to God as well. That's how we ought to be. We want to be like Christ was. Christ is like God is, and we can attribute all of those same attributes to the Lord, and call him perfectly self-controlled, perfectly perfectly peaceful, perfectly merciful, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. He's perfectly patient with us, perfectly gentle and good, and all of these things. But he's also perfectly just, which means that in his wrath, he is being perfectly wrathful, perfectly angry when he has anger, because of his perfect justice. So when he is angry at something being done, we have to accept that that's God's character, and we can't call it into question, be like, whoa, God, you're hurting our feelings because you're feeling this way toward these people or what have you. Rather, our job is to go, okay, God, we understand where we have gone wrong, and so we're going to acknowledge your majesty and your holiness, and we will align ourselves with you. We're not going to play the but you hurt my feelings, but this isn't fair, or any of those kinds of cards. Rather, we're just going to submit ourselves to God's authority and not think that we know better than him. So we should not downplay or emphasize any character of God over another, because God is perfect in all things. So then that brings us to our second section, relating to God. These are the first few commandments. I always get the number wrong. I think it is, and we'll count as we go. I used to say it's the first 5 are how you relate to God, and the second 5 are how you relate to your neighbor. I think it's closer to the first either 4 or 6. It's an uneven division of the number 10 are how you relate to God, and then the latter half are how you relate to our neighbor, where Jesus gets his delineation of the greatest commandment is love the Lord God with all your peace, with all your mind, soul, heart, and strength, which is basically summing up the first half of the 10 commandments, and then love your neighbor as yourself. If you loved your neighbor as yourself, you wouldn't murder your neighbor. You wouldn't covet your neighbor's wife. You wouldn't lie to them. You wouldn't go against your father and your mother. Those are your neighbors as well. These are all things that God has put in place for us to relate to him and relate to one another. So let's read the first few commandments. Verse 3, do not have other gods besides me. That's number 1. Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above or on the earth below or the waters under the earth. Do not bow and worship to them, and do not serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. So those are the first 2 commandments. Have no other gods besides me. Make no idols. Don't worship idols. That's all the same commandment. Verse 7, do not misuse the name of the Lord your God, because the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath day to the Lord your God. You must not do any work, you, your sons, your daughters, your male or female servants, your livestock, or the resident alien who is within your gates, for the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them in 6 days, and he rested on the 7th day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy. And that is the first 4 commandments relating to God. So the question here is about the Sabbath, but let's first look at the first few. So God first says, do not have any other gods before me. I have used the illustration of a trophy case for many years to describe how God should fit in our lives, where God deserves to be on the trophy case of our lives. And God deserves to be at the top shelf. God deserves to be the top priority, the highest shelf in our lives. And he wants it to be a shelf that is large, that is wide, that holds a huge trophy, but none other than him. No, nothing else gets to go on that top shelf. Not our wives or our husbands, not our kids, not our parents or grandparents or other people or sports or our favorite thing or our job. None of that gets to share the top shelf with the Lord. He is a jealous God. He tells us that in verse 5. Have no other gods before me. But then he goes on in verse 4, don't even make anything. Don't make an idol, a physical image of another deity, and worship it. So he expounds, he clarifies, don't worship any other gods, don't pray to any other gods, but also don't just don't whittle or carve an image of Baal or an image of me or an image of anything and worship it, because like the Israelites did with the golden calf, they made a golden calf, and Aaron said, this is the God who brought you out of Israel, because he thought it would be helpful for the Israelites to have a physical thing to see and to worship. And, it's a really good idea, except for the fact that it was a really bad idea. Aaron was misguided in his thinking that the people needed a physical thing to worship when they had the God of the universe at their fingertips, at their every behest. They could go to him. And Aaron, being the high priest at this time, he could go directly to the Lord. And he knew that, but the people didn't understand how God could hear their cries, and yet he could. So don't make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above or on the earth below or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow and worship them. Do not serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. This word kana in Hebrew, or probably chana in Hebrew, suggests a demand for absolute devotion and exclusive service. God tolerates no rivals. Again, he wants that top shelf spot in your life. He wants that top shelf place in your devotion and in your admiration of things that have happened to you and things in your life. He wants that top spot, and he doesn't want to share it with anyone. And then he goes on with a warning. I said earlier that there's probably not much warning. Well, here is a warning here. Because I am a jealous God, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children to the third and fourth generation. Well, that's your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and your great-great-grandchildren. My grandfather lived to be 93 years old. He passed away the day after his 93rd birthday. My grandfather had has great-great-grandchildren. And God is saying here, I will curse a family for 100 years, essentially, based on the obedience or disobedience of the grandfather. But to mirror this and put contrast to this, you can see the Lord's mercy here. I will show faithful love, verse 6, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. I'm not going to go and delineate how many greats there would be in front of all those grandchildren that God will bless for someone who loves the Lord. So if you love the Lord, God promises to bless your family for 1,000 generations. Then he says, do not misuse the name of the Lord your God. We have also read this as do not take the Lord's name in vain, because the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuses this name. What does that mean, misusing the name? That's using the name as something like, and as a phrase, as God is my witness, I won't do this thing. That's swearing an oath. And God doesn't want you to use his name for personal gain. For personal financial gain, so using it as a seal on a promise or anything like that. He wants you to only use his name because it contains and embodies his power and authority, and it demands the respect. It demands the same respect that we would give to the Lord himself. So he doesn't want us using it for our own personal gain or benefit. Do not misuse the name. Then verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath unto the Lord. You must not do any work, you, your son or daughter, or male or female servant, your livestock, anyone who lives in your family, the resident alien who is within your city gates. For the Lord made the heavens and the earth and everything in them in 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord has blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy. So what does that look like for Christians? What does honoring or keeping the Sabbath look like for us? Well, we have changed the day of the Sabbath to the Lord's Day, to Sunday, because of what Christ did for us and the day he rose. So we celebrate the Lord's Day together, and that's what starts our week. For many, that is their Sabbath, but not necessarily is the Sabbath on Sunday. For the Jews, it was on Saturday. It was the last day of the week. The first day, God created the heavens and the earth and light, and there was light and there was darkness, and then it was day 2. It was Monday. But for us, keeping a Sabbath, keeping a day of rest, whether that be on Sunday, whether that be on Friday, whether that be on a Wednesday, whatever it is for you, take a day of rest, because God created the Sabbath and blessed the Sabbath because he knows that we as humans need to rest, and we need to rest in him and the mercy that he's given us. If we work too hard and we're too busy, it is too easy to forget to worship him. And so that's why it's good to move your Sabbath, your personal Sabbath, to a Sunday where you're not going to work, you're going to church, you're going home, you're resting with your family, you're getting ready for the week, the week to come. That's the first day of the week. It's a really good way to start your week. And so it's important for us to do that because we were not made to work all 7 days, and God gave us that example in creation. And then Jesus even said in Mark 2:27, he says, he was talking to the Pharisees who were accusing him of working on the Sabbath, and this is not an excuse to work on the Sabbath. This was Jesus basically saying, I'm Lord of the Sabbath, but the truth he says here is the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. God created the Sabbath for us to give to us. It's a gift unto us so that we can rest, so that we can take a break from our labor. We can rest in him and worship him and be at ease from our labor. And that is why it's important for believers, so that we don't get caught up in what the world says and get caught up in little league games and caught up in work and all of the paperwork and mess that happens with a daily job. We can take a break from it. We can cut ourselves off from that and rest. And he wants us to do that. And then we have the second half of the Ten Commandments. Starting there in verse 12, this is how we relate to others. The first of the second half is not about our neighbor, but our parents. Honor your father and mother so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Paul calls this the first commandment with the promise. Honor your father and mother, for this is the first commandment with the promise. I don't remember where that's found off the top of my head, but Paul says it. And the promise is that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord is giving you. So for the Israelites, he's telling the children and adult children, not just young children, to honor their parents. So take care of your parents when they're old is one way that we can do that. But for children, actual children, it was obey your parents, do what they say, and do what they say so that you may have you have a long life in the land that the Lord is giving you. They're about to go into the promised land, or they thought they were going to the promised land here. And so obey your parents so you can have a long life. This is what I'm going to give you for the honoring of your parents. Then, so that's number 5. Then number 6, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony against your neighbor. And then finally, the last one, do not covet. And this is split into 2 sections. Do not cover your neighbor's house, and then, so his possessions, and then do not cover your neighbor's wife, his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. So first, like I said, there's a shift here that happens with the 5th commandment, honor your father and your mother, from how we relate to God to how we relate to others. Well, what does honoring your father and mother look like for adult children? Like I said, taking care of them when they're old and can't take care of themselves, but also listening to the wisdom that they have. They've lived a long life. They've lived probably, as I think would be actual in anyone. I can't think of a case in which it wouldn't be. They've lived more life than their children. They're going to naturally be older than their children. All parents ever have been older than their children. And so they have wisdom that you don't have. So listen to them. Take the wisdom for them. If there are adult children like myself or Grace or other members of Emory Baptist Church who are adult children, listen to your parents. It might not be fun, but they will have more knowledge about the world than you will because they've lived more life in the world. So that's one way it can look like. Another is making sure they're respected and they're dignified in their last days, taken care of and watched over. And then finally, the last 4 commandments: do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony or lie is what that means. Is just be honest in all things. And then do not cover your neighbor's house. Do not covet your neighbor's wife. This is, that word covet isn't just don't be jealous. It is don't be so jealous or crave or desire what your neighbor has to the point where it is inappropriate or causes you to sin, where that's the only thing that you can focus on, that you've become obsessed with what your neighbor has rather than what you have. And so how does the way that we relate to others bring God glory? How can we honor God by the way we relate to others? Well, by doing these things, by being kind, by being good neighbors, as Jesus would say, as Ronnie preached about the Good Samaritan a couple Sundays ago, breaking down those fences that we have that divide us so that we can be good neighbors. When Jesus was talking about the Good Samaritan and who your neighbor is, he was painting the picture that this is an Israelite man who is beaten and robbed and thrown on the side of the road into the ditch, and the Samaritan came up. The Samaritan had the most claim to not have anything to do with this man because of the tension and animosity there is between Israelites and Samaritans. And yet the Samaritan, who probably had suffered mistreatment by the hands of Israelites at some point, he stopped and did the right thing and was a neighbor to the Israelite. He was the one who was more godly than those who went before, the high priest and I don't remember all of the titles, but it was a high priest and then a Pharisee or something that went past the man first. So instead of expecting others to go out of their way for you, go out of your way for others, and that honors God. So follow the 10 Commandments. Keep the Sabbath holy. Make sure you have a day of rest. Make sure you have a day of worship. That's more important. And I hope that your day of worship will be Sunday morning at Emory Baptist Church. Thank you so much for being with me today. I look forward to worshiping with you very soon. Bye-bye.